Nick, thank you so much for sitting next to your microphone for all this time so that we could record the second half of your top 10 Sherlock Holmes movies list.
Of course, this is the most important thing I have to do. So
I
sitting
knew
here,
it!
I've got nothing but time.
So, for those of us who weren't here before, here's a quick recap. I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Welcome back to the second part of the chat with Nick Cardillo and his top 10 Sherlock Holmes movies. In part 1, we looked at the 1939 Adventures of Sherlock Holmes starring Basil Rathbone and the 1944 film The Scarlet Claw starring Basil Rathbone, the Peter Cushing Hound of the Baskervilles from 1959, and A Study in Terror with John Neville as Holmes from 1965. And now, hang on to your dear stalker for the second half of his list. The next film on your list is quite possibly my favourite Sherlock Holmes movie in the whole wide world. So would you please go right ahead and tell us all about your next choice? Because it's also part of a new category, isn't it? Holmes reinvented.
We are talking about The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes from 1970, starring Robert Stevens and Colin Blakely.
What a great film.
Billy Wilder, the man who gave you The Apartment and Some Like It Hot, now reveals The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Watson in his lifetime recorded some 60 cases demonstrating the singular gift of his friend Sherlock Holmes. But there were other adventures, which for reasons of discretion were withheld from the public. Adventures which involved matters of a delicate and sometimes scandalous nature.
We're not going to spoil anything right now because I think you did say you're going to challenge me to pick a favorite at the end of this discussion. But I think depending on the time of day, this is an easy frontrunner for an absolute favorite. Every time I watch this movie, I find something new in it. I am endlessly astounded by just how beautiful this movie is, how hilarious this movie is, how smart this movie is, and just how darn entertaining it is from start to finish. How do we want to go about discussing a movie like this? Do we want to jump right in with the deleted bits and mourn their loss?
I tell you what, let's quickly summarize what the approach is, because I think what we want to do is at least explain what it is that we like about the film. Because yes, it is one of those films, a bit like Magnificent Ambersons and other great films where parts of it were removed before it was finally screened, and a full restoration has not become possible, partly because the truth is that it was never edited in a final form. It was shown in test format. It tested very badly, so they cut it down, and what started off as something that probably with an intermission would have probably been close to 3 hours ended up being just a smidgen over 2 hours with a lot of it removed. Let's quickly talk about what's the private life of Sherlock Holmes. What's the approach here? What's the storyline?
So the idea is that we are discovering some previously unpublished and unknown about exploits that Watson has written about his time with Holmes and Watson. And these stories have been kept back from the public due to their sensitive nature. And what is so sensitive about them, we learn through the various vignettes. And as Sergio alluded to, there were originally, I believe, 4 segments in the film. 2 of them were cut. And so we get a sort of anthology film, or what is remaining of an anthology film. We begin with an extended prologue, I believe, called The Adventure of the Russian Ballerina. in which Holmes and Watson are invited to the Royal Ballet, where the head ballerina of the company has a very unique and hilarious proposition for Holmes, and his manner of getting out of it is even more funny. And then there is the bulk of the film is a segment that is called The Adventure of the Dumbfounded Detective, in which Holmes is asked by the wife of a inventor to locate her missing husband. And in doing so, he runs afoul of his mysterious brother Mycroft and a scheme that will take him all the way to Loch Ness in Scotland and a confrontation with the monster itself. What I think is so delightful about this movie is that there is clearly so much love that we haven't even mentioned it yet. This movie is directed by Billy Wilder and written by I.A.L. Diamond. There is so much love that they have for Doyle and the characters and the world that he has created, but they are not afraid to gently poke fun at that world. And I was struck on my most recent rewatch. I think the magic trick that this movie pulls off is its handling of tone. There's a scene in which Holmes, Watson, and their client are in a cemetery just outside of Loch Ness in Scotland. Their investigation has led them there. And the scene and the tone and the atmosphere is perhaps not bordering on gothic, because we're not quite in the Hound of the Baskervilles territory, but it's moody, it's somber, it's taking itself very seriously. And we get a very stern warning from a gravedigger, I believe played by Stanley Holloway, who's warning them against going to Loch Ness.
The story is their boat capsized in a swell, but I don't believe it.
What do you believe?
Well, you may think I'm an old fool and old drunk, but I've been living around Loch Ness all my life.
Are you trying to tell us it was the monster?
Damn right. MacLennan saw the kids' faces when they were pulled out of the water. Looked just like old men. They must have died of fright.
That's incredible.
Is it?
And then the next thing you know, the scene transitions and we are heralding the arrival of a group of circus performing dwarves who have come to mourn their brethren in the cemetery. And so now we're into the realm of the faintly absurd. We've gone beyond some of the eccentricities and the extremes of Doyle, and it just feels like the logical extension of what sort of stories he was telling. And I love how well they thread the needle throughout this entire movie.
The tone is one where you're supposed to be appreciating it with a modern eye. You're looking back so that you can appreciate but also smile a bit at the peculiarities of a distant age and the points of view. But at the same time, because it's done with such humanity and wit and humour and warmth, I think the characterizations work very well, but it holds together very nicely, and it doesn't undermine the great detective at all. I think that the fact that the reason why he doesn't get things right in this film are for, shall we say, the best of reasons, and I think they do him credit, and they tell us something new about him.
What do you think of the performances of Robert Stevens and Colin Blakely? Because they're slightly off-center of the norm. And I think it's one of the most unique things about this film is the presentation of the central duo.
To pick to the instant bugbear, Blakely, who's a terrific actor with an enormous range, for the most part, he's been asked to play it a little bit humorously. That does mean that when he brings some gravitas to it, it really works and it gives it. But I kind of wish, particularly in terms of what's left of the film, that perhaps he hadn't always had to be the kind of humorous butt of some of the jokes and things, particularly in the first episode, obviously. On the other hand, the scene, with the dancers at the ballet is wonderful.
It's beautifully done, and it's so funny. It's so funny.
And it's not insulting. It's very nicely done, and I think that's all great. And particularly because it's, the way it's shot is just so clever. And I think it makes the joke rise and his bewilderment and so on, and we know that is kind of what Watson is like. So I think, he's a ladies' man, and that he has that he's a man of his time. Sherlock is kind of not quite a man of his time, I think. And so Stevens is giving a more overtly emotional sort of performance. In a way, it's a more modern interpretation. I think one that we would now connect with more easily. Wilder was said that he cast him because he had a face that looked like it could be hurt, which seems like a mean thing to say, and maybe it's just a line. But at the same time, Stevens, of course, was a great Shakespearean actor, but who was never a movie leading man. He'd made plenty of films where he had a decent role, particularly famously in Pride of Miss Jean Brodie, where he appeared opposite his wife of the time, Maggie Smith, and he's got a good role in that, but it's her film. I think he's wonderful in it. I absolutely think he's wonderful. I don't think it would work on a TV show once a week. Having talked about how the stories could work, I think it's obviously here it feels like almost like 4 episodes glued together, maybe, but it's a very rounded performance. I mean, what I'm pleased about is that in the re-editing, they kept the beginning and the substantial end. So the arc of the film is maintained. What you lose is some episodes and a flashback that you would have had along the way. One of the episodes, you get to see what would have happened if, it's the classic thing with Watson sort of saying, what you do isn't so difficult. Well, now that you've explained it, I get it. So he says, right, they're on a boat. It's this very expensive sequence with them, when they're on this ship. And Watson gets to investigate the crime. It's a joke sequence. The payoff is a completely humorous one. And it's fine, but it isn't really necessary. It's making this point about Watson realizing just how hard what Holmes really does do. That's why it's there. But it's very elaborate. It's almost a bit lavish. And you sort of think, okay, I can understand why you might want to take that one out.
I've seen the scene recreated, not necessarily endorsing the use of AI, but they added some soundtrack to the scene. It's on YouTube.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, God, okay. No, not seen that.
It does not turn out great, but it gives a better approximation of what the scene might have looked like than I think it is included as an extra without the soundtrack, and you're sort of just reading what the dialogue.
Yeah, you get subtitles, because the soundtrack is lost, yeah.
So I've seen the scene recreated, and I think it gives a fairly decent representation. Honestly, I think the movie is better without that sequence. It's the one time when it sort of feels like the movie is tipping all the way into parody, whereas the rest is really walking that fine line in between homage and parody. Going back to Stevens, I think he's brilliant in the film, and he sort of plays Holmes like an Oscar Wilde character, and you sort of almost get a little bit of Wilde's, I think, own personality in his performance. He's sort of styled even to look a little bit like Wilde with the wavy hair. You get the melancholy of the character that really up until this point had not been presented. Kim Newman, I think, points to The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes as being this turning point in the history of the character, that Stevens' performance and the way that the script interrogates the persona of Holmes is really where we see so much of the rest of Holmes's depictions on film come from. All of them are sort of seeking to psychologize Holmes a little bit, and they're determining that there's something inherently broken in his psyche that made him the way that he is, and he's sort of coping with it by being as cold and aloof and standoffish and brilliant as he is. And I think it's the way that Stevens handles it is really nicely done. The creators of Sherlock, Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, have pointed to this film as really being sort of like the Rosetta Stone for the way that Sherlock sort of went on its own interesting trajectory. And for all of the accolades that show has received and the performance of Benedict Cumberbatch, which is admittedly excellent, nowhere in that show do they get to the heart of what Stevens does in this movie as subtly and as carefully as he is able to do. it would be, I think, remiss of us while talking about the private life of Sherlock Holmes not to mention the absolutely gorgeous soundtrack provided by Mikkel Schroza, whose central themes in this film are haunting and beautiful. One of his finest scores, I think, and it really adds to the film in an immeasurable way.
It's derived from his violin concerto, and apparently Wilder was writing while listening to the LP of the concerto. In fact, the first time that Roger knew that he was working on the project was because he rang him up and sort of said, "I've worn out the LP, can you send me another copy?" And Roger actually appears himself in the film
as the conductor, yes,
in the scene from Swan Lake, which of course has a thematic link to the story. It's a close-up of Roger in the pit conducting the orchestra, and then it sort of zooms out, and again, beautifully shot by Christopher Chalice. But I've got this terrific recording by Yesha Heifetz of the concerto, and easily findable on YouTube as well now, but I have it on CD, those things you used to be able to buy, and I've listened to that so many times. There is a re-recording of the soundtrack, and you can just hear the soundtrack but with the sound effects as well. That exists, but it has all the romanticism of the film, and it's such a huge component of it. And it was the most expensive film Wilder ever made and his biggest flop, so it's that horrible combination. And yet it's such a beautiful film in every way. I think it looks great, it sounds great. As you say, tonally, it doesn't really get a foot wrong. I think some of the stuff that they shot, they hopefully they would never have added it, because I agree with you. I think the honeymoon lovers segment doesn't really work. And also, annoyingly, when you buy a Blu-ray or a DVD, unlike the Laserdisc, which I originally had from 25 years ago, they've now digitally fuzzed some of the footage because it includes some nudity. And so they've removed it. If I get my Laserdisc out, it's all there. You can see everything like nature intended.
That is, I did not know that. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, doesn't really matter at all. But I'm so glad you mentioned the music, because I think music is a big component of these films, and not just because he plays the violin, of course, all that business. It's a major part of this film. And it was literally in the writing, in the creation of this film. Because it went through multiple iterations. Originally it started off as a musical. And there's a version of it where it's musical. There's a version of it would have been Peter O'Toole. There's another version of it would have been Peter Sellers.
Yep.
Wilder worked on it one way or another for a very long time. I mean, years went by while he tried to crack it. And I think it was a colossal disappointment to him when he just couldn't get what was the roadshow version, in essence, because the market dropped. It wasn't just that test screenings weren't strong. It was the idea that the roadshow idea was this idea that big expensive films that were made on big budgets, and they would have an intermission and would have an overture, and exit music, and you presented them at higher ticket price and suited big epic films like, say, Ben-Hur, El Cid, what have you. But by 1970, that as an exhibition strategy seemed to be no longer working. And so they decided they didn't want to do that anymore, and therefore they didn't want a 2-hour 45-minute version of it. They wanted something much more saleable, and Wilder apparently got disheartened and sort of said, okay, go ahead, cut it. He just sort of walked away from it.
And you sort of get the impression, knowing how the film industry was changing at that time, that beyond just the roadshow aspect, you might have thought that people would want something that's maybe a little bit more sensational, that's going to be a little bit more lewd in its discussion of Holmes's drug use, something that's not quite as gentle as the film ultimately ended up being.
It was October the 24th in the year 1891 that I heard for the first time in 4 months from my friend Sherlock Holmes.
So you were saying, so this film neatly takes us into the next one. So how does it do that, Nick? What's next on the list?
So the next film is The 7% Solution from 1976, starring Nicol Williamson as Sherlock Holmes, Robert Duvall as Dr. Watson, and Alan Arkin as Sigmund Freud. This movie is based on the 1974 novel by Nicholas Meyer of the same name. He also adapted the novel to the screen. What do you think of this movie, Sergio? Because it is a curiosity to say the least.
I'm a big fan of Nicholas Meyer. I like his novels, I like his films, I like his screenplays. So I'm a big fan. Elephant in the Room, I think Robert Duvall as Watson is catastrophic. Mainly because of the accent. Because the accent's awful. It's just bloody awful. And every time he opens his mouth, I keep wishing that they'd got somebody decent to dub him.
On this particular day, a telegram from his landlady, Mrs. Hudson, had been delivered to my surgery, imploring me to return to my former rooms without delay.
To have an actor like him play the role is very interesting, of course, because you've got an actor who's known for brooding intensity and intelligence and, you know, kind of still quiet quality, and yet someone who has tremendous range. Brilliant actor, and obviously recently passed away. So it's not that he's not potentially well cast in the film, but the accent is so dreadful. And I think he is playing it in a slightly stuffy way, because that's how he thinks he should be playing an Englishman from the Victorian era. And I think it's just the most god-awful piece of miscasting. And it's very frustrating because, of course, what they've got is a situation where the actor who's playing Holmes, Nicol Williamson, was not well known at all in terms of box office. So they hadn't cast a well-known actor to Americans to play that role. It's not that they couldn't have found one, but they went with Nicol Williamson, who's actually really good in it. So it's a great idea. That really hurts it. Alan Arkin is doing a great job as Siggy. He's a great Sigmund Freud. We get Irene Adler. We get Vanessa Redgrave.
She's not Irene Adler.
Well,
She is
okay, I think of her as an Irene Adler substitute, but okay, you're right. You are, of course, right. In my head, she always is, but you're absolutely right.
I see the point of connection for sure.
I think it works as a film. It is obviously a peculiar film. Even the opening titles have lots of jokes in them, a lot of meta jokes, and that's coming from Nicholas Meyer. And he's having a good time. He was a very young guy at the time. It was this gigantic hit as a novel. One of the very first books to do really well in the way that it combined fictional characters and real life people to create an exciting story. And E.L. Doctorow would do that in Ragtime, and then shortly after, Stuart Kaminsky started doing a long series of novels featuring his private detective Toby Peters, and now it's much more common. God knows. There's an awful lot of rubbish ones out there.
It's fascinating to think, though, of a time and place, certainly because it was before my time, that a Sherlock Holmes pastiche is on the New York Times best-selling lists. It's staying there for a remarkably long time. Do we think that it's the combination of the historical figures and the fictional world, or do we think that it's the exploitation of Holmes's drug use? Because both in the film and in the book, I think the subject is handled really, really nicely. It's not exploitative. It feels like it's the logical nth degree of how you would take this quirk of Holmes's character.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could argue that feels very 1970s. This idea that he goes into analysis and to deal with his personal demons, which have led to his drug use, and the fact that he's had a mental breakdown, and that he keeps blaming this Moriarty person for all his problems when it's not really his fault. All this kind of stuff. I think that at the time, I think it felt new, it felt fresh, it felt exciting. And you genuinely felt like, I haven't read something like this before. It's fiction that's going in a new direction. And everybody starts to talk about it, and it snowballs. So some of it's just luck. But genuinely, I think that it just has all that energy and all that cleverness of youth. Because Myers was, in his 20s when it came out. I mean, amazing success so early in his life. I mean, I I think he'd already written a couple of screenplays, actually.
Mm.
Of course, and he's still writing Sherlock Holmes novels.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, I think the most recent one came out, last year or the year before?
Last
I
year,
think
yeah.
just fantastic. And he's such an interesting person, I think. And obviously, someone who's associated with the Star Trek films and things like that. He ended up doing all sorts of things.
Anytime you want to have an in-depth discussion about Time After Time, you can invite me
Oh,
back to
what
the
a great
podcast.
film! And another film with a Miklos Rozsa score, and I love that movie, absolutely. Yeah, and of course another Jack the Ripper movie, of course. But here it's that sense of a frisson that somehow you hadn't thought of before, but actually seems like a really great idea. This idea that somehow Freud, by this point, has become as mythical a figure as Holmes, despite the fact that he was a real person.
Mm.
And then you get into a full-blooded adventure. There's sword fights, there's all kinds of stuff, and it's a thrilling adventure. I think it holds up very nicely. And as I say, I think Nicole Williamson is great at playing this kind of neurotic version of Holmes. Again, I think it does it reasonably respectfully. And when I say reasonably, the bigger part of the film is him when he's having a very bad time. So we don't trust his powers of observation and deduction in the way that we expect to. But it does, I think, try to keep the human dimension present. Because, you could argue that Arkin, I think, is great, but Arkin is playing it a little bit humorously, I think. I don't know if it's the wig or the beard or whatever, but or the accent, but the way he's playing it. But he's great fun. Very much a movie performance somehow. It's a bit big, but it suits it. Even Laurence Olivier, I think, is having a good time.
I think there's a little bit tongue-in-cheek is perhaps not the right expression to describe the film, but I think it's moving in that direction because you're sort of getting, as you say, caricature of Watson, a little bit of a caricature of Freud. No other movie on this list ends with a sword fight on top of a moving train. So, I mean, that's just the type of film that we're talking about. But I think Williamson is really good as Holmes, and I think he described his performance as a little boy who's chasing after a butterfly, and you sort of see that in his characterization, and his twitchy, manic persona in the beginning when he's really, strung out on the cocaine it's a little unnerving just because, we know that he's playing, the world's greatest detective, the world's greatest reasoning mind, and we can't trust anything that he's saying. And there's this really paranoid, dreamy presentation to both his scenes and, we keep cutting back to the flashback of the young Holmes climbing up the stairs in the house, the payoff of which I'm not sure how I feel about. Sort of depends on the time of day.
Yes.
But again, it's a really interesting movie, whereas, Private Life of Sherlock Holmes sort of keeps the mysteries about Holmes a mystery. This movie fully seeks to answer all of those mysteries. It's probably the least successful aspect of it. I think if you just get, swept up in the adventure of it all, you're going to have a lot more fun.
Well, yes, apart from Robert Duvall. But although what's interesting is, of course, we've talked about some of the music scores, and originally Bernard Herrmann was booked to write the music for this.
I did not know that,
and he obviously had the bad taste of passing away before he could start working on it. So that literally that was his next commission. He'd signed the contract, so they got John Addison, who of course had replaced Herrmann on
Torn Curtain.
Addison's fantastic composer, wrote the music for Tom Jones and things like that, but he'd also written the music for Sleuth, which is very jaunty. And here he writes this kind of waltz, and and it's the kind of scores that will eventually lead him to do the terrific Murder, She Wrote theme music, which he will always be best known for. Personally, if you haven't seen it, but if you ever watch a miniseries called Centennial, which is from the James A. Michener novel, blockbuster, like 12, 13-hour miniseries based on one novel, because the novel's just that long. Addison wrote an incredible score for that. I mean, just absolutely fantastic. But anyway, that's by the by. That's from my youth.
There's also a song in this movie written by Stephen Sondheim, which
That's
is
right.
which is rather fun.
That's right. Exactly. So it has a sort of an interesting feel to it. And I think that it could have come across as a bit of a lark. And somehow, I think partly because I think people were impressed by the book and they were respectful towards it and didn't treat it in any way disdainfully. It doesn't come across, and it's important, with films like this where, I mean, I think hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about a couple of Holmes pastiches where a less serious approach is taken, but which I think work. Here, I think that there is a strong humorous element, but they don't let it get away from them. And they do keep an eye on the story, and it just, tonally, they basically get it right. And as I say, I have sometimes mixed feelings about Herbert Ross as a filmmaker, but he did Last of Sheila, again, the Stephen Sondheim script, of course, and was going to do The Goodbye Girl the following year, which is the biggest hit he ever had. And then eventually did Footloose, which Footloose is fun, but it's kind of stupid, but it doesn't mean it's not fun all the same. Steel Magnolias, which, I refuse to comment on, but my mum loves it. What can I tell you? But I think that this is a terrific movie, terrific score, looks great. There's lots to say about it. I love the fact that Meyer has regularly gone back to writing more Sherlock Holmes books. I think that's terrific. I don't think any of them have had anything like the amazing success that this had, but as you say, it's probably unrepeatable, isn't it?
Well, I wish that this film had been a bigger success. I think it was greeted a little bit tepidly at the time. I think sort of what we're talking about, that people weren't sure if it was funny or not, which sort of we're talking about as a little bit of as a positive aspect. But I think at the time, people didn't quite know what to make of it. But I really wish that it had been a greater success, and maybe I know that there was talk of adapting the West End Horror, which was his second pastiche,
which may or may not be another Jack the Ripper story.
Well, it's set in the world of English theater, and it's a great read. I really like that book, and I wish that we could have gotten to see Williamson and I'll say it, Duvall reprise their performances for another go around.
Yes, but dubbed by James Mason or something.
Well, speaking of, that takes us into our next film under discussion from 1979, the second of two Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper films, Murder by Decree, starring Christopher Plummer as Holmes and James Mason as Dr. Watson.
Something stalks the streets. Something possessed of animal cunning and fury.
I understand you know something of the Whitechapel murders.
I have seen the man known as Jack the Ripper.
Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson plunge into the Victorian underworld, seeking the answers to the most puzzling case in the annals of crime. Who is Jack the Ripper?
Which I think in my life was the first Sherlock Holmes, my cinema-going life, was the first Sherlock Holmes movie that came out of the cinema that I was aware of. So as a new film in 1979, so I would have been 8 going on 9. I remember it coming out.
Did it make a big splash at the time?
Not especially. I mean, obviously, films like that shot in the UK, fantastically big cast, British-Canadian co-production. I think 60% of the money came from the UK, 40% came from Canada. Cost about $5 million. I think that it came at a time when the British film industry was at a very low ebb. And at least this was more or less a British film about an intrinsically British subject in every sense. And so from that point of view, people were going to be very interested in it. And obviously it's got such an impressive cast. And I think from that point of view... Now, having said that, I was too young to go see it at the cinema. I'm fairly sure that the rating it had wouldn't have allowed me in. I didn't see it at the time. I was just aware of it. So I knew it was kind of, I read about it. As I say,
sure.
I really want to see this. And again, it's this idea, this compelling idea of the Sherlock Holmes mythos, which is almost more important than the stories themselves, than the character himself. It's just the mystique is just incredible. So you've got it in your list. And again, there's some odd things about this film, apart from which is that it's semi-based on a weird British TV documentary. Tell all. How come you've got it on your list? What is it you like about it?
I view this movie as the post-Watergate Sherlock Holmes movie because for the first time we sort of have Holmes operating in a world that is more reflective perhaps of our own, that it's not everything is quite as it seems. We can't always just take authority at face value. We sort of have to question the motives and means of people around us. We're operating fully in shades of gray in this movie. Obviously, the elephant in the room is that, in all likelihood, Jack the Ripper was not associated with the royal family at the time. But it makes for a really fascinating story and a really interesting concept. And it's one that hasn't gone away, even though it's been debunked. I have not read all of the tome that is the From Hell graphic novel, but it's on my list. I actually did rewatch the rather interesting film adaptation a couple days ago. It's not terrible.
I think that is called damning with faint praise. Not terrible, in inverted commas. Put that on the poster.
But Holmes and Watson work in this film in a way that they don't often work in other movies because they are sort of, as you say, it's more about the Holmes mythos. It's more about the idea of Holmes and Watson than they are as characters in and of themselves. And that's sort of why we get Christopher Plummer playing Holmes the way that he does. He's very warm. He's very genteel and very down to earth. He's smoothed out a lot of the rough edges that we might have seen in Peter Cushing or Basil Rathbone, even Robert Stevens from earlier in the same decade. James Mason is a revelation as Watson. He's really one of the best, I think, that's ever been on the big screen. He's a little bit too old for the part, but the camaraderie that he has with Plummer's Holmes is wonderful.
Well, he's a genuinely intelligent Watson, isn't he? Although watching him eating peas is one of my favourite moments in movies. I love that moment. I really do. It's so sweet.
You squashed my pea. Well, now you've got it cornered. Yeah, but squashing a fellow's pea. I'm just trying to help. I didn't want it squashed. I don't like it that way. Squashed. I like it whole, so that you can feel it pop when you bite down on it. No, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking.
I love how the movie is bookended with Watson. Because again, in the stories, he is our eyes and ears to the world. And so in the beginning of the film, we have a scene where Holmes and Watson are attending a performance at the opera. The Prince of Wales is late to the performance. And so when he arrives, the crowd in the upper gallery begins booing and begins, hurling insults. And it's Watson who leads the campaign of, God save His Royal Highness, as he says, trying to arouse the support of the crowd below. And so we see Watson sort of with blind faith in the aristocracy and within the system in which he operates. It's not for nothing that one of the very last shots of this movie is just a close-up on James Mason's face. Once they've unmasked the killer and once they've revealed the conspiracy at the heart of the empire, we're left with Watson just sort of reflecting on everything that they've gone through and how his worldview is now fundamentally changed. He is not the same person that he was at the beginning of the film. And it's beautiful. It's so subtle. Bob Clark behind the camera does not hit us over the head with this sort of imagery and with this deeper meaning. It's really expertly done.
Yeah, and again, it's quite emotional its own way. The little vignettes you get with Geneviève Bujold, that's heartbreaking. Bits with Donald Sutherland, an interesting little cameo, again, because of the Canadian money. Is this the first Sherlock Holmes film which we see Sherlock Holmes cry?
Yeah.
That works really well. But as you say, it's James Mason's Watson is what gives it weight, because it's that way that it hits him and the way that he plays that I think really moves us fundamentally, but obviously aligned with Holmes's own sense of despair and frustration and anger and disappointment, this sense that, why don't you care more? Why doesn't this matter to you? It works tremendously well. But as you say, yes, it's I think to call it a post-Watergate Sherlock is fair, because I think when you compare it with 7% Solution, it has a dark tinge to it, but at the same time it also has a kind of very kind of humorous element to it as well, a kind of, an adventurous spirit. This is older, slightly sadder, more melancholy, slightly slower film as well. It packs a lot in. Perhaps you could argue it packs a little bit too much in. It feels like it should either be 40 minutes longer or 20 minutes shorter. But nonetheless, I think what's there works very, very nicely. Having talked about this being the first Sherlock Holmes being advertised, we're now reaching what I think is the first Sherlock Holmes movie I ever saw at the cinema. And it's certainly a very unusual and unexpected one. And this is one that is in a brand new category, which is, you called it A Different Holmes for the Modern World. So tell us what this film is, because, by the way, I love it.
This is The Great Mouse Detective from 1986, featuring Barry Ingham as the voice of Basil of Baker Street. And Sergio, I bet you never thought that you would be discussing The Great Mouse Detective on your film noir podcast.
No, but you know what? I'm glad we are, because damn it, it's a wonderful film. I saw it in Singapore, I think. No, did I see it in Singapore? Yeah. I was living in Singapore at the time. Went to see it at the local cinema, and I just immediately fell under its spell. It was kind of Disney going back more or less to traditional animation style and storytelling, and absolutely knocking it out of the park, although it has a famous sequence that was created with some digital tools, which is the big climax in the big clock, which is a theme that we'll return to in another one of the Sherlock Holmes films we're going to be talking about shortly. So it allowed it to do certain dynamic things. But I loved every bit of it. I love the music by Henry Mancini. The songs are fun. The conceit is great because it is this idea that the mouse detective lives just beneath where the real Sherlock Holmes lives. And in fact, you get a little bit of Basil Rathbone's voice as well, which is taken from a commercial recording. It's not from one of the movies. They sourced it from elsewhere. And I can't remember if I noticed that at the time. But I love the idea that, so it's a Sherlock Holmes movie in the sense that Sherlock Holmes is real and is in the film, but it's about Basil. And I tell you, if you just want to watch me completely fall apart with laughter, all you have to do is show me the sequence when Basil says, "Toby, follow." And Toby falls down and slaps him down on the head, and he leaves him completely stunned. And it just makes me laugh my head off.
Toby! Seek 'em!
I love the timing of it. It's so funny. I think it's splendid. I think it's a great choice here.
It is an utterly charming movie. I can't help but fall under its spell every time I rewatch it, and I just did a couple days ago before this chat. It's just like a warm hug of a movie for, especially for Sherlock Holmes fans, but even just in general. It stands on its own as a fun, family adventure. The animation holds up so well, and with, as you were talking about, the integrated computer elements, I love Barry Ingham as the voice of Basil. He is excellent, and the way that they've written the character is so in keeping with this, heightened version of who we think Holmes to be. I think it's interesting that he could have, made for a live-action Holmes himself. He played Dr. Thorndyke in an episode of The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes and does a pretty decent job. But obviously, the real star of the film is the voice talent of Vincent Price as the arch criminal Professor Ratigan, who gets a couple of great songs in this film. Price is just absolutely delightful as the Moriarty equivalent, who disposes of his undesirables with his trained house cat. I think Petunia, is her name. It's a delightful movie. I love it.
I absolutely agree with you. I was so glad when I saw you put it on your list because I think it's marvelous. Now, we're going to go here from something that I absolutely adore to something that I'm not very a big fan of. So I'm afraid you're going to have to work a little harder here, Nick. You're going to have to sell me on the whole Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes thing. So why did you do this to me? We were going so well, and all of a sudden now I've got to deal with a Guy Ritchie movie? I mean, come on. Tell me more.
All right, I'll do my best to plead my case. So the 2009 Sherlock Holmes was, I believe, it was the first cinematic theatrical experience I had for a Sherlock Holmes movie because, and I believe I'm right in saying this, it was the first theatrically released Sherlock Holmes film since Without a Clue, 1988, which was a movie I debated putting on this list, which is a lot of fun in and of itself, and definitely would recommend checking it out if you're not familiar with it. So I have a very soft spot for this movie because 2009 I could not have been a bigger Sherlock Holmes fan. I was reading the pastiches, I was watching Sherlock, I was seeing this movie in the theater. This was the height of my Sherlockian mania. And so to have this movie that, for all intents and purposes, I think does a lot of justice to the character. Yes, he is an action hero and there are explosions and there's, this fast-paced, quippy sort of 21st century dialogue that we've come to associate more with Downey Jr.'s performance as Iron Man in the Marvel comic movies than with the world's greatest detective. But I really urge any Sherlockian who thinks that they're above these movies to go back and look at them again and separate as best you can the explosions and the action and some of the more unbelievable elements, shall we say. And you will find that the essence of the Conan Doyle character is preserved. He remains the intellectual genius that he is of the stories. And the fact that they just heighten certain elements that are there in the text is a brilliant way, I think, of bringing the character to a whole new audience. We know from the Sign of the Four that when Holmes is not involved in the case, he goes and bare knuckle boxes with, ruffians. And don't think I haven't looked in the credits. The man that he is fighting is credited as McMurdo, which is the name of the bodyguard from the Sign of the Four. So you get points there. You get points for quoting the canon. The fact that Downey Jr. tells Jude Law's Watson that his mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work. It's there. It's in the canon. We get even a nice callback to the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which appeared earlier on this list, in which Holmes has captured some houseflies in a jar and is trying to manipulate their behavior with his violin. I just find it so delightful. And I feel like if this is the modern context that we require to expand the world of Sherlock Holmes to a larger audience, then I don't really have a problem with it. Because the same thing happened with BBC Sherlock, and as that series went along, I feel like they got further and further away from the modernized canonical ideal that they had started with. So in the two Downey Jr. movies, and personally, I think the sequel is even better, Game of Shadows from 2011, you still get the essence of the characters as they existed. You get the essence of this profound friendship that exists between Downey Jr.'s Holmes and Jude Law's Watson. You get the power of those characters and of their world. Crucially, I think that that's a big part, that these movies don't seek to set them in a different time, in a different place. They are going to create Victorian London as it's really never looked before, with, enhanced CGI and things like that to really bring this world to life. They are crowd-pleasing action-adventure movies, and I have spent many a fun night in the company of some friends watching these movies and pointing out all of the canonical Easter eggs that are buried in there. And speaking again of the sequel, not for nothing, I think Jared Harris's Professor Moriarty is one of the very best that has ever been put on screen. He manifests everything that we love about that character while managing to be just as insidious and as devious as any representation of that character has ever been. There's a moment in the Game of Shadows film where Moriarty has Holmes in his clutches and hoists him up on a large hook that really I will never forget. It is a blood-chilling moment in an otherwise quote-unquote family-friendly action-adventure movie. So that's my case for the Downey Jr. films. I think that they are so much fun and they have so much packed into them that Sherlockians really ought to keep an eye out for.
Oh, how I've missed you, Holmes.
Have you?
I barely noticed your absence. I'm knee-deep in the single most important case of my career. What are we up against here? The most formidable criminal mind in Europe. Professor James Moriarty.
I'll have to watch them again because I take your points here very seriously. I believe I saw them both at the cinema when they came out. I don't particularly go for Guy Ritchie's kinetic style, and it doesn't matter whether he's doing The Man from U.N.C.L.E. or he's doing King Arthur. I once wrote an article about him, and I think it got cut, but I refer to him as being all mouth and no trousers, which is a British phrase that doesn't necessarily translate, and my editor thought that was pushing it, so out that went. But my point being that I tended to find it all a bit meretricious, a bit superficial. They just didn't seem to be any particular depth to it. Now, having said all of that, I do like Robert Downey Jr. I do really like him in Iron Man, but I was a big fan before that. It's an interesting idea to put him in a film like this. I think physically, I'm not sure he entirely sort of convinced me in terms of, shall we say, the canonical idea of Sherlock in terms of height, width, so on and so forth. But having said all of that, I think that the idea that they're both sort of younger and action-adventure-y sort of figures is not outside of the way they're depicted in the early stories. As we say, I think we talked about earlier on about this idea that Holmes in particular is a dynamic figure and someone who does sort of leap about and do things. And, you know, the jokiness I don't mind. I mean, there was also that, is it right at the end of the second film when he sort of disguises himself with to match the wallpaper? It's that one. You know, I don't know if that's a post-credit sequence or something, but it's, you know, it's one of those things that I thought, what? These are very restless films that Ritchie makes. It kind of feels like it's made by people who are on a permanent sugar high. Also, mind you, the score for, I think, the second film is really odd. They take a whole track from an Ennio Morricone Western and just leave it in there. There's a scene when they're on horseback and they're riding along. And they just leave it in there. And obviously it was part of the temp track. And either they ran out of time or just couldn't be asked. They just leave it in there. And it's properly credited, you know, which is unusual. But because it's literally, they used like a minute and a half of it or whatever, you know, it's substantial. So you can't miss it. So tonally, it's completely different from everything else we've seen in the movie. And that's the kind of thing that tends to get my back up, because I was like, this is silly. How does this fit in? But you know what? I will go back and I will try again, my friend, and I'm going to give it a go. Having said all of that, we've come to the end of the road, and we've come to the last film in your list, and quite rightly, we've got a film about Sherlock sort of coming to the end of the road as well. What film is it we're talking about, and what do you think about it?
We are ending our discussion with Mr. Holmes from 2014, starring Ian McKellen as a aging Sherlock Holmes. I believe they say he's 96 years old in the film.
I think 93, but you know what?
93.
He's very old.
a 93 or 96-year-old Sherlock Holmes who has retired to Sussex to keep bees and is finding that age is catching up with him and his mind is not working as sharply as it once did. And he is doing everything in his power to recall the last case that he ever undertook and the reason that he decided to retire in the first place. This is based on a novel called A Slight Trick of the Mind, which, funnily enough, is one of the Sherlock Holmes pastiches that I have actually never read before. I have heard very good things about it, but I've also heard rather difficult things about it. That it's a hard book to wrap your mind around a little bit. That it's a tough read, and I would not say that the movie is a tough watch, despite the subject matter. That we are dealing with Holmes who cannot remember, succumbing to age and senility. You know, it's difficult to watch a Sherlock Holmes who has trouble even just getting out of bed unassisted. You know, this is a very different presentation. It's a very difficult presentation of the character, but it is not antagonistic or hard on its audience. It's still a rather gentle film, I think. And at the heart of the film is the performance by Ian McKellen as Holmes. And obviously McKellen is a singular talent. He's a singular actor. So just to have him put his own stamp on the role is worthy of time and effort.
His name is Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Is that him?
My mother, she wonders if you have brought your famous hat.
The dear stalker. I've never worn one.
And a pipe?
I prefer a cigar.
Did you do the thing?
What thing?
The cane shows the marks of a dog's teeth. The wood is from an island southwest of Madeira. That thing.
That was an embellishment of Dr. Watson.
That being said, I don't know if, say, beyond what he's doing as the aging Holmes, if McKellen really does a whole lot unique in the role. There are large sections of the film where he is playing a younger version of the character. And while I think he's good, he's not putting his own stamp on the role as, say, Christopher Plummer did or even Robert Stevens. He's sort of just doing the Sherlock Holmes thing. But it's still good enough, as I thought on my most recent rewatch, that you do sort of wish for an alternate reality where, say, in the mid 90s, perhaps before Lord of the Rings, that we got a chance to see McKellen do Holmes properly, whether it was on television or in film, and see him play the role under more ordinary circumstances. But what do you think of this movie?
I think you're absolutely right, which is that he isn't necessarily really playing Holmes. He could be playing any great detective in their final years. It could be Campion, really. It could be Ellery Queen, as it were, who, if anyone who's read the first Ellery Queen novel, turns out that he also retired to keep bees or whatever, having married and having children. And that got lost after the first novel. On the other hand, I think that he plays that very well, and I enjoy that. And it would have been fun, I agree, to see him, the final cases of Sherlock Holmes, and to have him playing that, and to actually have Watson, because Watson's in it, but you never see who they are. It does something very interesting, which is that I think that the way that it handles a character who is known for his gigantic intellect, and therefore the disappointment and the worry that comes when that begins to fail, I think is obviously a big deal. So in a way, that's, in that sense, the right character to pick. But if all you had to do was pick a famous detective who were well known for being very brainy, as opposed to one that was tough with their fists. I think he does it well. I think the emphasis here is on the story with the housekeeper and her son. It's set in 1946 primarily, which again is just unexpected. unless it's Barrett of Rathbone. But otherwise, you know, you don't expect to see Holmes sort of surviving the Second World War. And that's intriguing, but they don't particularly do anything with it either.
Even putting Holmes into the context of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just putting the character into those surroundings is unusual act in and of itself.
Here, I think that you get an interesting take on why he decides to retire and him trying to retrieve that information. I like the film, but I think it feels, like I say, it's quite a soft, audience-friendly film. I think that it conforms a little bit to that, in inverted commas, heritage style, you know, which is that everything looks brilliant because it was in the past. And so everything was clean, everything was gorgeous, you know, everybody was beautifully dressed, never a hair out of place. That doesn't take away from the fact that it's well played and well put together. Obviously, it was a reunion from the people who'd made Gods and Monsters, you know. Bill Condon, that's right. And not a dissimilar idea in some respects, you know, the later life of a famous person. And I think here, you know, it leads to a sort of emotional conclusion, which is a nice one to have. It doesn't exactly come out of nowhere, but it's a kind of sentimental finish that you don't entirely associate with the character, but it's presented as something that's a positive development in the character very late in life. And you're thinking, okay, well, I buy that as an idea. I'm not sure you've entirely dramatized it that successfully, but I think it's a very interesting take on the character. You know, Holmes has been done in so many ways, so that to have this idea on him, you know, in his 90s, in his dotage. I will say, because I know you're a fan, you know, the Jonathan Barnes written audios for Big Finish. Now, he did his own version of why Holmes retired and moved to Sussex.
Is that the Sacrifice of Sherlock Holmes?
I cannot remember the titles of the series in any order.
You know what? It's the first one. It was the Ordeals.
Is it the Ordeals?
Of Sherlock Holmes.
Okay.
Yes.
I prefer what Barnes did. I like the audios that Big Finish put out, especially. I think Barnes is a superb writer of Sherlock Holmes stories for them. And Richard Earle is just possibly the best audio Watson ever, right? He's just wonderful. Excellent. And so I always, any opportunity to promote those. So I don't rate it as highly as that, because I like the way they handled that. On the other hand, that has fantastical elements that, or science fiction elements that I could live without, frankly. But nonetheless, give it that's their style, and that's what they've gone for. I think that's, you know, here it's much more grounded, and I think that it does lots of interesting things. You know, when he goes to the cinema and he sees a movie adaptation from one of Watson's stories, you know, and it's Nicholas Rowe playing, you know, who had played him in Young Sherlock Holmes, and he's playing Sherlock Holmes in the black and white movie he goes to see. That's superb. That alone was worth the price of admission. They don't do anything with it, especially. It doesn't lead to anything, but it's just such a great idea. And perhaps that's what the film tends to feel like a little bit. It's full of really great ideas and notions. It does hold together as a narrative. It does work. I think as a story, it's fine. I think the flashing back and forwards is handled in a fairly digestible way. I don't think it feels complicated. It's not Nolan-esque. It's not hard to penetrate the style. I think it could have done more. I think it could have been a more incisive kind of film of that treatment, and also it could have been a more incisive film about old age, as you say, you know, all these weighty themes. But that's not what they're trying to do. Like you say, you wish there were more of it, that it were a series or something, because I feel like it's alluding to lots of things, and I would like to have seen them developed, because here it's perfectly fine. It's perhaps one of the least interesting, or one of the least fulfilling of the films that you have talked about here today, and I've so enjoyed listening to you talk about them. But no, I don't mean that. That sounds like a very harsh criticism. But I think everything that's good about it is perfectly evident. It's all on the surface. It's a very, very nice surface. And I think it's worth doing. But I think you see it once and it's all sunk in. Don't think you necessarily have to go back to it. I don't think it has any hidden depths. Whereas Private Life Sherlock Holmes, I can watch and rewatch that film. And the same goes for The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The same goes for The Scarlet Claw. I mean, most of these films I own on Blu-ray, and I've watched them over and over again. Mr. Holmes, I don't. It's true. I saw that on streaming. So I thank you for that, because I think that you've come up with such an interesting mix of styles and approaches to the subject matter. And I think that this has been, just a fascinating odyssey. Now, I said I was going to put you on the spot. So out of these 10, what would be perhaps your favorite?
I'm going to answer that question, and then I'm going to pose another question to you. I know we're at the natural end point of our discussion, and we've been going a long time, but I want to get your take on something as well. So if I had to choose at this moment today, I would probably pick Murder by Decree as my favorite of the films on this list. And I think it's because it touches on something that we discussed about that film, that it's more about the Holmes mythos than it is about Holmes and Watson themselves. Holmes and Watson represent something bigger than themselves in that movie. They represent truth and justice and righteousness. They represent everything that the characters have represented since Doyle created them in 1888, excuse me. And that's why that movie resonates as much as it does with me, because they are standing in for larger concepts. That movie could exist without Holmes and Watson as characters, and it does. It's the aforementioned From Hell adaptation. But because Holmes and Watson represent purity and goodness and something so much greater than they are, it's the reason that I choose that movie as my favorite. So my question to you now in return is, the movies that represent the last section, this New Homes for a Modern World, all come in the wake of, I think, what a lot of viewers and scholars and critics sort of define as the definitive representation of Holmes, and that would be Jeremy Brett in the Granada series. I think there's a lot of people who say that Brett is the be-all and end-all, the definitive performance. And so we have seen now, since then, since 1984, when that series premiered, we have seen every permutation of Holmes. We have seen the action-adventure Holmes. We've seen the Great Mouse Detective Holmes. We've seen the retired Holmes, the modern Holmes in many contexts. In the truly awful Netflix streaming series, The Irregulars, we've seen the unreliable Holmes. Where do you think that we see the character going in the future? Do you think we'll ever get another period of canonical Holmes as we did with Rathbone and Peter Cushing and John Neville? Or do you think that ship has sailed, that we have a set in stone version? And where do you see the character going from now on?
I think the fact that it's out of copyright means that we are definitely going to get more. There's any question about it. Obviously, at the moment, there's now a Watson TV show. I've only seen the pilot episode. It's made by one of the people who used to write and produce on the Elementary show. So I find that interesting. And as I understand it, Sherlock does in fact turn up. So I'm curious about that. Although I find its mixture of medical and detection a little strange. Because I was going to say, what I suspect is more likely to happen going forward is, on the one hand, you will get more, now that you can adapt all the short stories and all the novels by Doyle without any problem. I think, therefore, someone is going to say, let's do a 10-part series for Netflix or what have you. And it will happen. We've just had the Young Sherlock Holmes series based on the Andy Lane books. Andy Lane's a terrific writer. And it's Guy Bloody Ritchie again. But okay, damn it. So things are already happening. I think that the idea that there will be a big expensive movie, that seems unlikely unless they really do a third Sherlock Holmes film with Robert Downey Jr., which they've been talking about for ages. He may or may not do it. Depends what happens. And that might be fun because by that point he'll be a bit older. And it'd be interesting to see if they want to play that in a kind of more mellow way or in a just more aged way. I think more Sherlock Holmes is inevitable. I'm fascinated by Sherlock Holmes stories that don't really feature Sherlock Holmes. I mean, obviously, we've also got Enola Holmes, all these things, right? Where Sherlock is a sort of subsidiary character.
Sure.
But also something like, Without a Clue, which was shot under the title Sherlock and Me, which I always thought was a much better title. I love that movie. I find it absolutely hilarious. Michael Caine's wonderful in it. I think Ben Kingsley's fantastic. Always makes me laugh. The minute he invariably gets attacked by a dog or something, I just burst out laughing because he does that sound and it just completely corpses me. I think it's brilliant.
It's about the greatest case of mistaken identity in history.
Excuse me, but you are Sherlock Holmes, aren't you?
Well, that depends. But it's time now for the public to learn the truth.
The truth?
He was an actor. Unfortunately, he was also a gambler.
There's a little matter of a gambling debt.
A womanizer.
Me! Did it again.
And a drunkard.
He's been at it again.
I never liked that woman.
You idiot!
I love that. So that, again, it's a Sherlock Holmes, it's a comedy, but it's one in which Sherlock Holmes, people think he's real and he isn't. So that's great. And I love Julian Simmons's mid-70s novel, Three-Part Problem, which is about an actor who plays Sherlock Holmes on TV and who gets involved in a real murder case. But he started to think that maybe he's Sherlock because he feels he owns the role, right? So again, it could be Peter Falk going out to solve a case because, of course, Conan Doyle famously did it himself as well with not great results. And there's that great Julian Barnes novel, Arthur and George. I don't know if you've read that, which is a very good novel, I think. I think the last 50 pages are not the best part, but I think on the whole it's a very good book. And so I think that will continue. I think the fascination with the characters, with the mythos, continues. I think what's been intriguing is the variations on the character that we keep having. And so in that sense, I'm not sure anybody feels that they've seen for a very long time the kind of definitive anything of these. I think when Brett came on TV, it was from a different era. I think, back on British television where there were only 4 channels, and no Sky, no streaming, no nothing. So he's wonderful, particularly, the first series, the second series, and Sign of the Four are fabulous. They're utterly, utterly fabulous. I watch those any day of the week. They're just great. I love the 2 Watsons. I think they're marvellous. I love the audios with Nicholas Briggs and Richard Earle. They're fantastic. I love I think the Rafe Richardson, John Gielgud audios from the early 50s. Terrific. With Orson Welles as Moriarty. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. They're really well done. I think they're great. So I think there's always going to be an opportunity for it to continue. On the other hand, you sort of say, well, it's so far in the past. How much interest can there possibly be? Well, Sherlock Holmes remains, along with Maigret and Dracula, the most filmed character in the history of filming a character. Is that likely to change soon? Well, the most recent series of Maigret was pretty bad. And so that's kind of disappointing as a fan for me. Dracula's never going to bloody go away. He is unkillable. So that's just fine. One would have thought going forward that the cultural touchstones would change. I hope not in some respects, because I think the short stories and at least 2 of the novels are really good. Not especially keen on Valley of Fear in particular. I was thinking...
I'll change your mind about that next time.
Okay, done. Look forward to it. But I think that there's lots of opportunities. There's still lots to mine there. The big thing about the Jeremy Brett was this sense that it was so faithful, so honouring the original. particularly the work of executive producer Michael Cox. He'd worked so hard to get that stuff right, and that they had worked so hard to get that stuff right, and that Jeremy Brett became as pernickety as Peter Cushing had ever been, but this time had a really good production to go with it, before his own health started to get in the way, and then the bean counters came in and changed the way they shot the program. But it seems to me that is an era that is completely gone. I can't imagine for a moment that will ever be a selling point. This idea that, no, I'm finally going to do it the way it should have been done. Obviously, it's hard to say that after over 100 years of adaptations, to suggest that somehow they never got it right. I don't think modern audiences are going to give a damn. So David Suchet's Poirot is not the last Poirot, and Kenneth Branagh's Poirot, which I think you and I liked and a lot of other people didn't. I think that's not the last Poirot. But this idea that you're going to sell it on the notion that this time you're going to offer it in this completely canonical, faithful, slavishly accurate version, I don't think it's going to matter, because I think the feeling is that it's just not going to seem relevant. Now, what about a version of Sherlock Holmes in which he's presented as someone who's neurodivergent, for instance? Well, that would be interesting. And if you can make it work dramatically, fab. That'd be fantastic, And if you haven't watched it, go watch Zero Effect to watch, alternative takes on the Sherlock idea. They're not Sherlock and Watson, but they are. And I think deep down what will persist and which hopefully will continue is the extent to which Doyle got it right in terms of that dynamic between these two characters and what they represent, the heart and the head, and their sense of comradeship. And it doesn't matter if they're two men or two women or what have you, or something brand new in between, whether one's an AI avatar and one isn't, whether they're gnomes, whatever it is. I think Johnny Depp did a gnome version, didn't he? Is it Nomeo Holmes or something like that?
Sherlock Gnomes.
Sherlock Gnomes. Sorry, I knew I got it wrong. That kind of idea. So I think that appeal, that essential notion that he got right, won't go away. What is frustrating is that sense that we live in a culture that's become ever increasingly disposable, and this idea that younger folk might perhaps not be interested in something that didn't come out in the last 10, 15 years. That's always depressing. Hope that's not true.
Yeah, let's hope for the brighter future that Conan Doyle couldn't kill Holmes, and he's as ever present in modern society, even if not in name. I mean, you can't look at a character wearing a deerstalker hat and smoking a pipe, even if you don't know the name Sherlock Holmes. You know what that represents. They're indelible things that I think will stand the test of time, regardless of what the presentation of the character is, or how faithful or not. Some of these things can never go away.
I think the genuine excitement when the Benedict Cumberbatch Martin Freeman series was so successful all of a sudden, when really they didn't think it would be. It premiered over the summer, which usually meant they didn't have big hopes for it, because you would normally premiere that in the autumn. And instead people turned in huge numbers to watch it, and it took off. And everybody getting super excited about how the hell did he not die when he jumped off the building. All that stuff, and a whole nation was gripped with that.
Oh my.
Sherlock, coming soon to BBC One.
And I'm thinking, I hope something will come along that will thrill everyone for the best reasons. And so that was encouraging, that there was a way to do it. So yeah, I think there's life left in the old duo, and and I hope to talk to you again in the near future, where we talk about the latest developments in Sherlock Holmes in fiction, some of which might come from you. Are you planning to do more
We will see. I will never say no to returning to the world of Holmes and Watson. My current work in progress is not Sherlockian in nature, but it's still mystery fiction. It's still detective fiction. My character is an intrepid investigator who smokes a pipe. So the DNA of the character is never far at hand. Let's put it that way.
It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you about this, Nick. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, that was at least a 4-pipe problem. That's what I'm saying. and we cracked it. Well done, you, mate.
Thank you. That was great.
You take care. You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.